This recreation is of this shirt that Edna St. Vincent Millay is wearing in this photograph taken in 1925 by the photographer Berenice Abbott. When looking at the shirt in this image, it looks like a white man's shirt with collar and cuffs. The collar appears to be pinned underneath the tie and quite tight around the neck. I believe the cuffs also have cufflinks. The pattern was bought on Etsy.
In terms of the shirt, it was almost impossible to find a man's shirt from the 1920s that was in the correct size. So I found this from the 1930s. It's very similar, I think, in cut. It uses cufflinks, and Millay is described as wearing cufflinks in a letter. I think the collar is correct, and I don't think shirts changed all that much from the 1920s to 1930s, apart from the fact that I believe this buttons down all the way, but I can stop it after 4 buttons like I saw in the 1920s patterns, but this one will actually fit me and save a lot of time in pattern making. So the pattern is a miniature in these semicircles, and then you use one of the bands to your measurements provided to enlarge the pattern onto another piece of paper. So I'm going to cut these out, then roll out some paper and start enlarging these pieces to my measurements, which is a chest measurement, and I'm doing 96 centimeters, which is 2 centimeters larger than my actual chest measurement because I want to make sure that there's enough ease in the pattern.
The first step in all of this was to read all the instructions provided by the pattern. There were several pages that indicated how and why you did certain things in order to get the measurements onto a second piece of paper. You would use the circle with the measurement band with numbers graded to your measurements, pivoting from the center point here, following the line and the number marked on the line. For instance, 24 units here, creating this line of 24 units on the measurement band provided. The measurement band pivots from this point, and for that 24 unit line, you would measure out to this point. This is basically complicated to connect the dots. So I made all the dots that were on the circles using the measurement band and then connected them using the ruler and a pencil. It's very difficult to see on this because I'm using a pencil on brown paper, but after I made all the lines, I then cut them out. There were also several pieces of the pattern provided in printout form that were not part of the enlargement that had to be cut out and taped together. Because my enlarged pieces were cut out from a rolled piece of paper, I then ironed them with high heat and no steam so that they would lay flat so that I could then cut out pieces of my mock-up. The mock-up pieces were traced, pinned, and cut on unbleached muslin. Here I'm cutting out the one sleeve as I only really needed to see how one sleeve would look, and that way it saved fabric.
So this book from the 1890s, and I have a 1920s edition of it, gives instructions for the opening of a shirt, which I thought was quite curious once I actually started reading it. So you make a slit in the fabric, cut 1/2 inch on either side, then make a box pleat that creates a pleat that actually runs down the entire length of the shirt, and obviously it's then stitched and reinforced. So this didn't seem normal to me because I'd never seen anything like it before. So I went looking online for some 1920s examples of shirts, and I found this one on Etsy, which had been sold. But if you start to actually look closely at it, because of the lines on it, you can see that there is actually a pleat that runs from this opening all the way down to the bottom, right there. So that was how shirts were closed in the 1920s, and they didn't button all the way down. As the 1930s shirt that I drafted also doesn't button all the way down, but the closing is slightly different. I believe it's an inserted piece. So what I'm going to do is take that gap where the inserted piece is on the pattern, close it, and then make this closure with the pleat.
Here I am tracing out the front piece on the fold. I'm now tracing out the very front with that gap there that I believe is the insert piece. I just carried it on, and then we'll cut it on the fold, and that will create the pleat after the fact because it is too wide at the moment for the collar. So a pleat needs to go in there in order for that to fit the neckline. I then stitched up the seams of the shirt, cut the seam allowance, and pressed the collar pieces. Then after rereading the instructions in needlework and cutting out, which were a little bit vague, I then pleated the shirt to see where the cut should be. pleating on both the top and the bottom, and then made a cut accordingly, and then pleated and pinned the front of the shirt.
So here's the shirt mock-up. It's quite long, which I think is period accurate. You can see this closure here. My sewing machine didn't really go through that, so I've just pinned it. The sleeve is sitting really nicely on my shoulder, sort of at the right point. And then this closure up here is quite tight, which it's meant to be because the shirt is very tight. The collar will be slightly longer in the next version, and I think I need to make both just a tiny bit longer because I think it's just a little bit too short. So I'll add maybe ½ an inch to it just to have it fit a little bit better. And then there's an issue with the back. You can see the gaping. So the yoke at the back is too long, which means the back piece is also too long. So I'm going to measure how much extra there is there and take that out of the pattern.
So then to adjust the pattern, I trimmed the collar pattern, traced it, added ½ inch seam allowance all around, traced that. The collar band provided with the pattern was too large, so I traced it and made a new piece slightly smaller. I then cut both pieces out of the paper. After these pattern adjustments, I now made new pieces out of muslin, pinned and stitched them together. This time it fit a lot more comfortably while still tight, which it should be, and the collar was a lot bigger and lower on myself, which looked closer to the actual image I was trying to work towards. I then measured on the back piece and the back yoke about 1 inch off so that it would work with the new collar measurements.
I have the pattern completely done now from the mock-ups. It's been adjusted and I believe it's going to fit. I have this quite dense cotton, which I believe is a bed sheet from the 1960s maybe, from my grandparents' house. I'm going to iron this, cut stuff out, and then sew it on the treadle machine. The thing is, with this garment, it's not going to be like a factory made shirt, which is entirely possible and very likely it's what Millay wore. And that is mostly due to the fact that my machine is not a factory grade machine, it's a domestic machine, literally in the name. And also the books and the sources that I have to go by are generally handmade garments or books that teach you how to make garments by hand, not the books that teach you how to work in a factory. So it's going to be probably a slightly different construction to what Millay would have worn, but it's still in some respects accurate to the time.
I began by ironing the fabric quite well so that there were no creases left in it. And then I proceeded to cut out all the pattern pieces that I had previously adjusted from the mock-up. The process of cutting out the pattern pieces was to weigh them down. Here I used pound and 2-pound coins, traced with tailor's chalk, and then cut out with my fabric shears. Here are all the pieces for the shirt laid out, several of them cut on the fold, but you can see every single piece that will go into this shirt laid out on the ground here. With the front piece, I pressed the center front seam so that I had a sense of where the middle was. Tried the pleats here, where I'm just adjusting accordingly to try and make it as even as possible and make the center front sit down the center front. Once I think I've achieved this, I press with my hands, and the fabric holds memory here so that it will keep the pleats where I've pressed. And then I will open it back up again and see where that line is that I should cut with my shears to open that front pleat. Needlework and cutting out doesn't specify how long this cut is. I've chosen 13 inches plus a ½ inch on either side. Knowing as I set the collar in this shirt I will likely have to adjust these pleats, I provisionally pin them about 1 inch on either side. Then as I am sewing all these pieces on a treadle machine, all the books that I have read recommend that you baste your pieces together first instead of pin them while you put them through the treadle machine. This is incredibly important as the treadle machine requires you to get momentum up in order to actually make stitches. You can't be stopping and taking pins out as you would with an electric machine. So here I am, basting my pieces together, less or more than 1/2 inch, which is my seam allowance on this pattern. It's just hand basting big stitches with a cotton thread over and over and over again on all the pieces that I will stitch first. This is the arms, the collar, the shoulder seams, and the cuffs. Shoulder seams with the yokes are particularly important because you take each piece of the yoke and sandwich the shoulder seam of the front on either side. My treadle machine is a domestic machine which was sold by Sears and Roebuck's catalog. I believe this is from the 1870s. I haven't used it in about a year, so I was testing just to see if I needed to oil it at all by using the treadle before I started sewing. So as it turns out, the bobbin holder was broken. It's impossible to thread a bobbin into it. I took it to my sewing repair shop and they weren't able to do it either, so I actually ended up having to switch and use a different machine.
Here's the machine. It even has a motor which I can attach to it. So I gotta play around with this a bit. With my serial number, it goes between these two numbers here, so I know the date and the year, so January 16th, 1906. It doesn't have notes of where it was sold. I did buy this in the US, and it was shipped to me. So 1906 is this machine.
The 1906 Singer wouldn't fit into my treadle table, so I had to remove my 1940s machine here and then put in the 1906 machine into the same table. This also means that it would have to be powered electrically. So I took the motor off of my 1940s machine and put it onto the 1906 machine. I chose this one partly because it had a light, but also because of the foot pedal that attaches to it was my preference of foot pedal when I sew. Foot pedal is an older style that has a button on it that you push down with your big toe, and that's what powers the machine. After powering up the machine, I sewed some samples and messed about with the tension of it.
Some tension issues. Okay, we're in business.
I started by seaming up the collar and the cuffs on the machine. Then I trimmed the seam allowance back to 1/4 inch, turned the pieces inside out, and pressed them. I then sewed the shoulder seams with a yoke piece on either side of the front pieces. This creates a double thick yoke. The back is sewn with a box pleat in the center. The seam allowance is pressed up in the inside yoke section that bottom is not sewed yet is top stitched down over the raw edge.
So the sleeve was too big. It has to come in this much. So I'm going to measure how much that is, which is 1 inch and whatever that measurement is. Just draw the line, the new stitch line, all the way along. The previous stitches will basically act like basting, and I just need to run a new line of stitches down this now. And I'll do the same on the other sleeve.
The sleeves are sewn with back stitches at either end. Because the machine only straight stitches forwards, the pieces turned around run the stitches over themselves. Here's the shirt without the collar or the cuffs and the front only pinned in place.
So here on the sleeve, I've pinned where I want the cuff to begin. I'm going to cut up there, turn it round and do a rolled hem, and just roll that hem round, and then I'll gather it and put it into the cuff. But this is where the beginning of the cuff is, the beginning and the end of the cuff.
So I did end up sewing a rolled hem, which you can see here. I also ran gathering threads before realizing I didn't like how it looked. I decided to pleat the sleeve into the cuff, and I'd seen this done on other shirts.
So I had this issue with the slits that I've cut for the sleeves where the cuffs are going to go. And without even thinking yesterday, I just did a rolled hem on them, and I realized I don't have any source to cite that this was the correct thing to do. So looked in the books. There's nothing in the books, but I do have, if this is a 1920s shirt, I have this blouse, which I think is from the 19-teens, and it has cuffs with a slit that goes up. You can see here, it's just a piece of fabric that's put on and sewn on both sides, just top stitched down. So I think I'm going to just cut a couple bits of fabric and attach those in. It's not particularly well made, but I'm going to just replicate this on these sleeves. I unpicked and pressed the cuff slits flat.
I machine top stitched the binding in place. In some places where it didn't catch, I whip stitched by hand the binding down on the other side. This is something that is present in the 19-teens blouse.
Here's a blown up version of the cuffs from the Etsy shirt. I don't think there's top stitching along this line, so I think I'm going to sew them in. Here they're gathered. I'm going to put pleats in instead, because that's what I've seen before on other shirts. And then stitch one side and then turn over and fell the other side so that I don't get a line of stitching here.
Here I am pinning and then sewing the cuffs into place. I sandwiched the collar between the two band pieces and stitched it up and then pressed it flat, ready to attach to the shirt. I then pinned the collar in place to find out how big the pleats at the front of the shirt needed to be. Once I knew that, I top stitched them down. After the pleats were done, I reinforced the section where they met at the end of the slit.
Here's the shirt. Everything's sewn in. All the machine sewing is done except for the hem, which I'm going to trim and sew. But all of this just needs to be pressed and then hand felled. There's some hand sewing to do on the cuffs and on the collar. But it's done and it's sitting quite nicely actually. And then I have to do some buttonholes and buttons here, button here, and then a couple buttonholes in each of the cuffs for the cufflinks.
I just evened up the hem of the shirt, trimming the back so it matched the front, and then pinned it in place so that it could be hemmed on the machine. After the hem was done, I measured out where the buttons were supposed to go. The buttons I'm using are just shell buttons that I bought. Before attaching the buttons, I whipped the back of the collar and cuffs down, and then sewed the buttons on. I then cut the buttonholes. I always try the button through the buttonhole to make sure it's the right size before I sew it. Then, using a buttonhole stitch, I sewed all the buttonholes by hand. And here is the finished shirt. The front buttons, and the back collar, the cuffs, and the cufflinks. And here's a final comparison between my recreation and the original photograph.